Perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome to Maria, and yeah, I'll let you carry on with your talk. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Abby, for inviting me, and hello to you all. It's great to be here and to talk about social media. First of all, I want to acknowledge that this is a really difficult year. So well done for making it this far in a pandemic. You're doing great. So far, I think, yeah, let's move on with social media, but you're doing great. Don't forget that. Okay, so I like to kind of preface this talk by saying that I'm not talking about social media analysis. What I'm going to talk about today is about how to use social media data for your research. And you'll see throughout the presentation that I've chosen some very specific language, and this is part of being really specific about what I'm going to be doing today. So using social media data for research is our presentation today. And what I've done is that I've structured this presentation so that we can consider social media data at the different stages of the research process. And so to do so, I'm using the elements of research as part of Breiman's book, Social Media Methods, Social Research Methods, which I will give you a list of resources at the end that you can have that with you. So these elements of the process of social research include literature review, concepts and theories, research questions, sampling cases, data collection, data analysis, and writing up. And this might seem like it's really simple or something that you've already talked about in other methods classes or that you've talked about in your dissertation classes. But I wanted to reiterate that this is how we're going to use social media data throughout these processes, these elements. So the first step in your research process is to consider what will be your research question, or what exactly do you want to know through your project? What are you trying to get at? This will help you guide your decisions in your literature review, in your theoretical framework, and your methodological approach. And two of the most frequent starting points are, why do museums use social media, and how do museums use social media? And there's a lot of literature on these subjects, but they kind of tend to be divided into three categories. So using social media for marketing, as a channel to engage audiences and visitors, or as a tool in an institution's technology arsenal. So at this point, you kind of need to consider what aspects of social media are you going to focus on? And depending on the answer, you will need to collect certain types of data and consider using social media data in conjunction with other types of informations, such as that you can collect through interviews or focus groups or documents or things like that. So when you're deciding on what to focus on for your research, you will most likely be reading various sources of literature to understand and contextualize your topic. And as you're reading, there are two key aspects to look out for. First, you'll need to consider what is already known about the topic, including what theories and methods have been applied, as well as how the authors that you are reading are referring to social media aspects. Similarly, you'll want to familiarize yourself with the history of the platform and the relationship of the platform and your chosen topic. So for example, if it's social media and audiences, or social media and organizational strategies, or social media and marketing, these are the kinds of relationships that you might want to keep an eye out for. You'll also notice that there are certain phrases or key terms that are often associated with social media. And here you need to decide on what terminology you're going to use, because each carry on their own connotations with research. So for example, consider the differences between users and audiences, as one may imply an active role, whilst the other one is a more passive one. So this is the second step that you need to take in your research. You need to choose a vocabulary and be aware of the biases that you apply when you use them. The theoretical framework you use for your research is entirely up to you, and I will not discuss this here. I will say, however, that how you choose to frame your research may impact how you treat social media data in your collection and analysis. So whether you're using a deductive or an inductive approach, you need to consider the different questions that you can answer by using social media data in your projects. Similarly, the methodological framework you choose will impact how you approach social media data. these listed here are 3 ethnography-based approaches that you might want to look at. So you have digital ethnography from Sarah Pink, E3 Internet from Christine Hein, and netnography from Robert Kozinets. Although these approaches are similar, they imply different framings of behaviors online, how we can observe them, and what language we use to describe our observations. So they have different implications on how you treat social media data in your research project. But once you know what you're going to focus on, the existing context of your research, and the frameworks that will help you make sense of your research, you're going to be ready to start collecting social media data. And at this point, you need to decide what exactly you're going to collect, how you're going to collect it, and how much you're going to collect. And unfortunately, I'm here to dispel any myths. There isn't a magical number of how much data you can collect, just as there isn't a magical number of interviews that you're going to collect or number of participants for an online questionnaire. All of this will depend on the frameworks that you decide to use and the context of your research. So for example, you might decide to use one platform over another or focus on a key person or an event that took place. You'll need to consider the kinds of resources that are available to you and the skills you need to do this collection. There is software available that you can use to automatically scrape websites, and I'm going to talk about tags, which is this Twitter archive Google Sheet. But as well, there are alternatives. If you know programming languages like R or Python, you can also write your own script to collect the information that you need. I'm not saying that you have to go out from this webinar and start learning R or Python or anything like that. But I'm saying that if that's something that you already have as a skill, then you might want to consider how you can use it to collect social media data. Alternatively, you may decide that the data that you need is the one that's all readily available as part of a platform's metric system, or the metadata that you can collect from the social media platform. But if you don't have access to any resources or skills developments, obviously you can always save manually the data that you need. It'll just take you longer to do so, and there are some ethical concerns about just saving data manually. Okay, so if you're collecting tweets, for example, there are a variety of social media data that you can collect, and some of this might be really obvious, but you can collect the username, you can collect the data posted, the date that the post was uploaded or made public, the textual content of the tweet, including hashtags or other tags like tagging another account, any visual media like images, GIFs, videos, and engagement metrics, such as comments, retweets, and likes. Or in other words, you can collect both quantitative and qualitative data from these posts. This will be different, of course, for other social media platforms. For example, on Weibo, you can also sometimes collect the type of device used if this is important to your research. Instagram data, for example, can vary from the number of posts and followers that a certain account has, the stories that they save to their page, the posts with numbers of likes, the captions on these posts, ITV, posts and numbers of views and comments within each one of these. How you decide what to collect needs to take into account the decisions that we've discussed so far. So from your lit review, to your theory, to your methodology, to the types of questions that you'd like to answer. If you decide that you need to collect responses to particular posts, such as the ones illustrated here, you need to consider what exactly do you need to collect and why, because this might include personal identification information, and this is going to be important for you in your ethics application. So you have to really consider whether you need these kinds of responses and what aspects of these responses do you need. So if you want to collect Twitter data in an automated manner, then I suggest that you use tags or a Twitter archiving Google Sheet, and you can just search this on a browser, and I'm sure that this will come up, but I also have a resource list at the end, as I mentioned earlier. So tags is a great tool that lets you archive tweets by searching with a specific keyword, such as a hashtag, a user account, or any other relevant word to your project. It relies on the Twitter's API, so it has limitations. So for example, it can only go so far back in time, 7 days, and the archive is not complete, just as a Twitter search is not complete. This is why you need to be familiar with the platform that you're going to be studying. My recommendation is that if you are going to be collecting tweets on an event or something that is happening right now, that you start collecting tweets as soon as you decide that this is what you want to do through tags. And this is because you can set up the archive to automatically update every hour. So it continuously grows until you stop it, until you tell it that you no longer want to archive any tweets. So the image that you see here is what tags looks like when you are trying to save an archive. And this is what it looks like on the other side. So once you collect the information, it kind of aggregates into this Google spreadsheet as such. So you have an ID per tweet, metadata such as the username, the time and date it was created, any geo coordinates that are saved by the user, language, and a bunch of other different things. Importantly, it includes the content, the textual content of each tweet. And in the cases where these tweets have visual media attached to them, it'll often come up as a link, as you see in the one in the blue box. So it comes with a link, 2 links in there. So it probably is an image and a link to a website. But as I mentioned earlier, because tags uses Twitter's API, it collects whatever metadata is associated with a tweet. And in this case, it kind of depends on what the user themselves are inputting. So you have to acknowledge these kinds of limitations. So for example, if you are looking to find out where are the users based that talked about a particular event on Twitter, you can see from this list that I will not know at all where these people are located, because these users did not add that kind of metadata to their posts. So you just have to be careful about those kinds of questions when you think about the data that's available to you. One way to get around the temporal limitation of the simple search of Twitter is to use the advanced search. So just Google Twitter advanced search, and you're most likely going to come up with this scrolling box that I just took 3 screenshots of. So basically what you can do here is you can look for particular keywords, and you can also look for particular dates. So if I wanted to look at, for example, this is based on the hashtag #AskACurator, and you can see that I collected data in 2018 and 2019, and I want to have an update for 2020 and 2021. Then I want to look at here, for example, hashtag #AskACurator from the month of September of 2020, so that I can go back and compare to the data that I have from 2018 and 2019. So this is a good way to go back in time, more so than this automated search. So once you finish your collection and you have a clean archive of social media, whatever this may be, whether it was an automatic search or a manual search, you can start analyzing this information. And I say a clean archive because eventually, once you start going through your data, you're going to notice that you have duplicates, or that you have information that has nothing to do with the research that you have at hand, like ads and other things like that. So you might want to keep a reminder on your timeline of your research that you always need a day or 2 to clean that data. So you can analyze your data quantitatively to answer questions such as, how did this event develop over time? Or who were the users involved in this event? How were these users involved in this event? And to do so, you can rely on the information that is available through the platform itself, such as the metadata associated with time, location, and user information. And you'll need software that can help you organize so you can analyze this data. The most readily available is Excel, but if you want to go really fancy and have the ability to create pretty charts, then you might want to consider using something called Tableau. And I want to make a point here in that when you have the archive and you start making these charts, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily analyzing the data. It means that you are organizing the data so you can then explain what it means through your theoretical framework and through the literature that you've been collecting so far. So this is an example of a research that I did on an event that happened at the Manchester Art Gallery in 2018. And this is a timeline of hashtags that I found in the online conversation that I was looking at. So these are based on about 20,000 tweets, and that's why you get this weird looking chart. So once you have the tweets that you collected, you can create timelines of the conversations. You can distinguish users' activities between original posts, posts where people are tagged, and retweets. And you can also explore secondary or additional hashtags like the image that you see here, or examine the different types of languages and locations that your users have. But remember that this depends on what the user included on their profiles, so your analysis might be limited in one way or another. You can also analyze the data collected qualitatively, and here you need to be more careful about how you decide to analyze your data, and always refer to your theoretical framework and make an informed decision after exploring the different tools available. Most often, however, qualitative analysis of social media data involves content analysis, thematic analysis, and for textual data, sentiment analysis. So this can help you answer questions such as what was being said, how was this being said, and you may want to continue using Excel to do this analysis or use other alternatives such as a software called NVivo. So again, this is from the same research that I mentioned earlier. And because it has so many tweets, thousands of tweets, I decided to use NVivo to thematically code the tweets that I collected. So this means that I went through the content of each post and I coded the post according to the themes that were emerging from the conversation, because this was in relation to the methodological framework I had set for myself. You might want to, for example, set some themes that you're going to be looking out for because this is what you read in your literature. So if you're looking at marketing, then you might want to say, okay, I'm looking at these 3 themes, and if anything else comes up from the conversation, then that's a bonus. So depending on whatever strategy you choose, you can code for the language that users utilized. You can note whether the post was negative or positive, for example, through sentiment analysis, and note if the user posted any media along with their text, such as photos, memes, or GIFs. And once you have all of your codes, then you can start looking for patterns, for emerging themes. And I will say that this type of analysis is iterative, meaning that as you code, some new themes may emerge. And in light of these, you might need to revisit an earlier analysis that you had. So a pro tip is to always keep a diary of your progress. So just keep a notebook aside and just keep a note of what you're doing every day for your project. And that way, if you need to go back and justify a decision that you made, you have a note in your diary and you can always refer back to it. So the end product for me for this particular research were 3 main themes in a conversation that I tracked online, and I illustrated this in this pie chart and through some anonymous posts, as you can see here. Both approaches have limitations. For example, quantitative analysis is often restricted to the technology that powers a platform, because you can only collect what the data that users input. The users you collect may be fake accounts or maybe bots, so you need to acknowledge this. And on the other hand, for qualitative analysis, you may not always be sure what people are saying just by reading their posts. So for example, sarcasm is difficult to detect. And if you're looking at an event that happened in the States and you are a researcher from the UK, you might have a cultural difference there you might need to account for. If you choose to use NVivo, learn from my mistakes and note that the database that you use to code cannot be downloaded from the software. So again, that diary I know saved my butt many times. So any other analysis that you want to have in conjunction with the thematic coding needs to be done within the platform NVivo or through other means. But in both cases, the major limitation is that studying social media data on its own does not answer why questions. So if you're only going to be using social media data for your dissertations, your research question cannot be, why does this happen? So for this, instead, you're going to have to triangulate your results with other types of data, such as interviews, focus groups, documents, and things like that. I will say also that social media data may seem like a really contained endeavor, but I would like to warn you that using this type of data is really time consuming. Collecting data manually can take a very long time. An automatic collection, as I mentioned earlier, requires cleaning, lots and lots of cleaning. The analysis process is iterative, so you need to account for various rounds of coding as patterns emerge. And finally, if you're like me, social media can be a rabbit hole. So when you want to check something online, beware of just spending time on something that doesn't really serve you for your research. Okay, so finally, I want to close this presentation with a discussion on ethics. And I recommend that you start thinking about the ethical considerations you need to take when you use social media data in your research. Obviously, if you're going to use interviews or other things that are there, it has also their own ethical considerations. But for social media specifically, I want to recommend two readings. So the first one is Townsend and Wallace's Social Media Research, A Guide to Ethics, and The Ambivalent Internet, which is a volume by Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner. So Townsend and Wallace created this framework for us to consider the ethics of using social media data at different stages of the research process. So for example, you need to be familiar with the platform you want to collect from, as these have specific terms and conditions about how content shared on the platform can be repurposed. You will then need to consider whether the users you're observing can reasonably expect to be observed by strangers. For example, as I mentioned earlier, do you need to collect data from responses? That's something that you need to decide. Can those people reasonably expect to be observed? That's something that you need to decide. Similarly, you need to take particular steps to protect your participants or the users you observed. For example, by anonymizing published content and ensuring that you do not collect from vulnerable participants. I also recommend that you read a blog post and a book by the same authors, so Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner. They discuss something called the ethics of amplification, or the ethics of amplifying willfully harmful behavior and data in your research. They ask, what is the potential for social media data to cause harm through my research? And this might not apply to you, but it applied to me during my own research. So for example, this kind of relates to our writing and the way that we reproduce social media data in our findings. In my research, I did not seek out to explore sensitive or contentious information. And yet I still managed to collect comments that were willfully harmful because they were racist and homophobic. So I decided not to publish these in my findings, and instead I described them as I read them. And I ensured to make a point in my methodology chapter to talk about the ethical considerations that I took for my research. And this is something that I strongly recommend that you do as well. So I know that was like a really like fast forward fly through social media data in your research. But to recap, if you want to use social media data for research, you need to make a few decisions. You need to start by focusing your research and ask, is this data going to be used alone or with other materials? What aspects specifically of social media are you going to study? And therefore, what are you going to collect? What data you're going to collect and analyze? And what do you need to take into account in order to collect and analyze this data? Whatever way you are going to frame your research, you will need to be mindful of the language that you use, the methods you employ, and understand the limitations and ethical considerations associated with this process. So these are the resources that I used in this presentation, but I will also recommend further reading if you're interested in TikTok, for example, or Instagram, or to learn about social media platforms and their affordances and things like this. As Abby said, I will leave this presentation with you as a PDF, so you will have that with you. And that's my email address and my Twitter handles, and my virtual door is always open. So if you want to have a chat, please let me know.
Okay, so just giving people a moment to note down your email address, and then also to okay, so we have a hand up from Georgina. If you want to stop sharing your screen now, then Maria, thank you. Then we can see everybody at once. So Georgina, you had a question.
Sorry, no, I was just clapping. I was just saying thank you.
Okay.
I have got a few questions, but I'm just trying to work out what I want to ask first. But yeah, thank you very much for that, Maria.
No problem.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So does anyone have any questions that they want to either write in the chat or to raise their hand, to clap, and then also to signal that they're going to ask a question? And Maria is very friendly, as you can tell.
Yeah.
So you can ask a tiny technical question or a big one.
I'll do my best.
You're curious about. Okay, well, while George is thinking of her questions, Isaac, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so with Twitter, like, obviously you were saying that like after a certain amount of time, the tweets can't be accessed through certain kind of searches. Do those tweets end up anywhere, or are they sort of unsearchable unless you go into somebody's feed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you automate the search, you can only go back 7 days as part of that automated search. But those tweets will always, as long as the users don't delete them, they will live on Twitter. So the internet is forever, kids. We have to remember this. So you can always go onto the advanced search and go back in time that way, rather than just relying only on that automated system. But yeah, great question.
Thanks, Maria.
No problem.
So just give a moment for anyone else to stick their thumb up or raise their hand or unmute themselves. I was just wondering if there isn't an immediate question, if you could just tell us, because sometimes it's easier to see how you can use social media data by example, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about your own research, Maria, just to demonstrate how, you know, why it was important to use that particular type of data. And
yeah, definitely.
What's your thesis?
Definitely. I'll talk about this and then I'll give the floor to Thorsten, I think is your name. I think your hand is up, right?
Oh, Thorsten, sorry, apologies.
No worries. So I'll do a very quick run through of my research. So for my PhD, I am looking at the potential influence of social media to organizations' brands. And my case study is the Manchester Art Gallery. So I wanted to see whether us as Twitter users or Instagram users could have an influence on the brand of the Manchester Art Gallery. So for example, if we tweeted something negative or something positive, what happens to those comments? Do they get taken up in the organizational bureaucracy behind the scenes at the Manchester Art Gallery? So I was fortunate where the gallery was unfortunate in that they had a media debacle in 2018. And I'm not sure if any of you were here at the time, but they temporarily removed a painting and it caused a huge uproar on Twitter. So I kind of capitalized on that and I looked at that event and to see whether that had any impact and influence to the Manchester Art Gallery brand. And because my question was about the influence of the event to the brand, I couldn't rely only on social media data. So I collected as much as I could using tags, so an automated system. But I triangulated this data with interviews and documents. So I went to the Manchester Art Gallery. I had 2 rounds of interviews at 2 different points in time. So my research has this longitudinal lens. So that's why I ended up using social media data, and that's why I'm interested in it. But yeah. Okay, thank you. Thorsten, did you have a question?
Thanks, Abby, and thanks, Maria. My question was actually very similar. I was going to ask you about your motivation or the wider motivation to use the example of Hylas and the Nymphs, which is the painting that was removed, wasn't it? And
yeah, no, thanks for that.
You've just answered that.
No worries. I mean, I can go into a little bit more detail. So when I first started my career as a PhD student, I wanted to look at the brands of 3 institutions that are called the Manchester Art Museum and Art Gallery Partnership, I think is called. So it's the Manchester Art Gallery, the Whitworth, and the Manchester Museum. And I wanted to see how kind of this related to their organizational strategies. So I always knew that I wanted to go into the organizational structures of the institutions, and I wanted to look at their brands. I also had a foot in the quote unquote digital realm because in my master's, where you are now, I looked at how visitors' experiences were being shown on Instagram. And I did that at a museum in Qatar, where I was at the time. And we'll go back to the presentation, but I included links to those two, not to like pat my own back, but to pat my own back. They're there for you guys to read it. So I'm still interested to see whether users' experiences or users' perspectives have any influence at all, because we always hear that museums are trying to reach out and not be broadcast mode and have this conversation with users, but is anything coming back? So we know there's a lot going out, and it's not really clear if anything is being received in any way. So that was my motivation, is to understand that feedback back into the institutions.
Thank you. I'm just checking to see if there are other questions. I've got a sort of follow on from that, if not, which is just, I mean, I'm sure for your PhD and your literature review, you've come across very many other studies that have used social media data, and I just wondered if there were other examples where maybe it wasn't looking at the same kinds of questions that you're looking at in terms of organizational influence, but you particularly liked an example of where somebody's using data in their research.
Yeah, absolutely. So I include some of these in the recommended readings, but one of my favorite ones is from a researcher in Australia. There are 2 researchers there. So Kylie Budge is one of my go-to authors to look at the relationships between Instagrams and museums' collections. So in her study, she wanted to look at what visitors to a particular exhibition were photographing and posting on Instagram. So the way that she did that was she looked at all the photographs that were taken from a particular exhibition, and she wanted to see whether people were focusing on selfies, as the narrative at this point was that Instagram is for people who are narcissists and all they do is take selfies, and the museum therefore is just a backdrop for these selfies. And what she ended up finding is that the objects of the collection were in focus of these images. So we found, she found the opposite, where it was the focus was on the objects, not so much on the selfies. So the narrative was there about the collection itself rather than the visitor's persona. So that's one of my go-tos because it's really interesting. It has to do with Instagram, and you don't see that very often. And she has a few follow-up studies from that as well. There's also a book. Let me just go back into my presentation so I can tell you exactly what it was. So there's an edited book called Museums and Visitor Photography. And again, I'm going back to Instagram, but the whole volume looks at different chapters and different relationships between Instagram and different museums. So if you're interested in Instagram and museums, this is a great book to go back to.
Thank you. Thanks, that's really useful. And you're mainly focusing on Twitter and Instagram in terms of your research. But
I am for now.
Yeah. Okay, does anyone have any further questions for Maria or ideas that they would kind of like to test out about ways that they might use social media data in research?
I have a question now. So with my dissertation, I'm looking to do research-based digital online with the hope of collecting data to then build an app based off the data that I find. I was kind of wondering what with Envivo and that kind of transcribing system, have you tried it with other apps other than like Instagram and Twitter, and how does it kind of work with those, if so?
Right. That's a great question. I haven't tried it yet, but I have to say that Envivo is the input that you can put into Envivo needs to be really well organized before you put it in. So for example, once you have a collected table in Excel, it needs to be organized in a way so that Envivo can then read it and make sense for it, and you can make sense of it using its tools as the software. So for example, you can definitely use it with interview information. And you can definitely use it with focus group information as well, so that the codes that you use to code your social media data, you can also use it to code interviews and things like that. And you can just go back and forth between the two. I haven't really seen how it can be applied with other apps, but I would be interested in that. So if you find a way for it, I'm definitely coming and reading your dissertation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Here's hoping I can do that.
Torsten, you had your hand up? You have your hand up.
Yeah, I forgot to ask. I actually had a question again about coding and the sort of, I suppose, creative and organizational process that comes before feeding the software, as you said. Is there like a gold standard for this process, how you do that? I mean, I did a similar thing in a paper last year, which was received fine, but I was sort of pulled up on the fact that I hadn't really sort of properly explained. So the lecturer said, well, this is valid, but you should probably explain a little bit more why you thought this indicator explains this particular thing. So if you think about social media, if a post is neutral, positive, negative. So is there a gold standard in terms of approving the indicators that you think make sense?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. And the short answer is that I don't think there is one, because it depends on the framework that you have based on your theory and your method. So I can describe from my experience the two types of coding that I had. So for my Instagram images, I came to my data already with the themes that I was looking out for and with the things that I wanted to observe about. And all of this was based on the literature that I had read up until that point. So I could justify the themes that I was trying to observe based on the literature. And this was backed by the theoretical framework that I wanted to use and the methodological approach that I was trying to use at this time, which was qualitative visual content analysis. For my Twitter research, on the other hand, I'm using theoretical and methodological approach called actor network theory, which kind of asks you to be really open to the kinds of themes that are coming up from this data itself. So I had zero preconceptions about what I was going to be looking at, and I kind of let the data speak for itself. What I would recommend is that if you are interested in doing thematic coding or sentiment analysis, which is what you mentioned about being positive, negative, or neutral conversation themes or comments, is that you read extensively about the method itself and look for examples where they have been applied to social media data, or at least the type of data that you're looking for. So look for sentiment analysis on Twitter, sentiment analysis and Instagram and things like that. It doesn't have to be in museums, and there probably won't be a lot of research based in museums where the museums are the case studies. So you might have to branch out to other industries or other case studies. And then I know I shouldn't say this, but emulate what those other researchers are doing and see how you kind of appropriate that and adapt it to your own research. Because at the end of the day, it has to be unique to your own justifications for your research. And that's what I would say is, I don't know if it's a gold standard or if Abby, you agree with me, but it's like how you appropriate that and how you adapt that for your research and how you justify it should be the gold standard.
I think just to say that, yeah, I mean, emulating meaning look at what they're doing and do the same. And it's a perfectly legitimate thing to be able to replicate somebody's methodology and try it in a different case. That's not a problem. That's not an issue in terms of plagiarism. It's actually, you're creating an opportunity. If their research stacks up, then you're creating an opportunity for comparative research, which should give your research integrity too. So yeah, I think that we'll introduce some literature around more broadly thematic analysis, because it's useful for coding and analysing qualitative data, whether that's from interviews or other forms in general, and we'll do a kind of specific session on that soon. But I was going to ask you, Maria, if I may, because I think it links well, that whether you have some suggestions or advice for setting up a kind of data analysis opportunity, and whether there's a kind of issue around timing. So if students are interested in looking at a particular set of conversations or form of audience engagement or whatever around a particular event, for example, is there a way that you can kind of foresee what events you're going to collect data around? Mm-hmm. And then another question I had, have you got any tips about that? Another question I have is actually, would you advise against making an intervention yourself to create data that happens in social media and that you can then analyze? So what happens if you kind of intervene and try to get conversations going?
Yeah, those are very thought-provoking questions, and I'll come back to the second one in a bit. But for the first one, I think that if you have an event that is coming up, like Museum Selfie Day or Ask a Curator or anything like that, then you can see in advance, or you can think in advance when it might take place. So you can start setting up the hashtags that you're going to be looking at, or if you're looking at a specific username, so a particular museum or gallery, then keep an eye on them, or set up your tags archive where you can automatically collect data from Twitter. But if you wanted to look at potential future events and you don't know when they're going to happen, then you might want to keep an eye on certain keywords that you are interested in. So for example, if you're interested in decolonizing museums and decolonizing practices that are happening digitally, then you might want to think about the kinds of keywords museums or galleries have used in the past, which might be the same that they use in the future. So if in the past they used Black Lives Matter as catch-all for decolonizing or whatever, then you might want to bring in Black Lives Matter as a keyword that you are going to search in your social media data. It's really difficult to predict the events that are going to take place. So I would say that if you're going to use social media data, keep it simple. Get an idea of the kinds of users that you're going to be looking for, the kinds of events that you're going to be looking for. And if you are looking in the past, so if you are interested, for example, in the Blackout Tuesday fiasco that happened, then go back in time and look at that. Do a little bit of manual digging, and it'll be worth it in the end. In regards to the second question, to whether you can create and stimulate conversation online, it can be really tricky ethics-wise, because you're inserting yourself to create an event that might not have necessarily happened without your intervention. So we can think about it in a similar way as like, what would happen if I touched an object in a museum? And you wouldn't plan for it, but if you did, it would create a kind of controversy or something within the institution. So if you plan on basing a research around an event that you're going to drive, then it needs to be acknowledged in the research process, in that this is what I'm doing. I'm going to create a controversy online. I'm going to create an event online, and I want other people to discuss it and to talk about it. And then I'm going to study their reactions to it. But if your aim is not that, if your aim is not to create that controversy, then I would question your bias and the participation that you bring to the event. But it's definitely very interesting. And if you have the kind of influence on social media where you can create such conversations, I mean, hats off, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. And actually, if I may, just one final question, which I think could be useful to anyone who's thinking of using it. Do you have any particular tips in terms, I mean, you've been through the ethics process with Manchester University for your PhD. In terms of how you, give us some advice really about using social media data in your methodology and your ethics application. What are the kind of key things that you need to account for?
Definitely. Now, this is me thinking back in time. And I want to say that when I applied for ethics, applying with social media data was not an option. As in, I didn't have to apply. And I'm not saying that you all don't have to apply now, but back then, it wasn't an option for me to apply for social media data. So I mentioned it in my ethics application where I mentioned that I was going to do interviews and focus groups as well. However, that wasn't really the focus, and it didn't really alter my application. So I'm not familiar with the process now, but I can tell you, for example, at MMU, where I am now, our ethics applications have to do a lot with how are you going to protect the anonymity of your participants, and how are you going to protect data that you collect. So this means that if you're going to collect data that is potentially personal identification data, like IP addresses, that might raise a flag in the ethics committee. And they might ask, why are you collecting IP addresses as a personal identification data? Or things like usernames. Protecting the anonymity is also very important. So I don't know the application form itself, but you could mention things like how you will keep the usernames anonymous, or you might want to rephrase the tweets in a certain way so that they can't be copied and pasted into a Twitter search field, and they can, retrospectively look for the username. And then protect the data always in a machine that's password protected, or in a system that's owned by the university so that the onus is not on you, it's on the university, things like this.
Thank you. I think that's really useful actually, because sometimes it's just about working through what you're planning to do and where the kind of risks are for personal data in particular, and how to manage those risks. And it's going to make your research more organized and more better to do that and to kind of set it out. And yeah, of course, sure, we can assist with the ethics application form, so don't worry there. Jason, you had your hand up. You have your hand up.
Yes, hello. I can't remember if you mentioned this or not. I apologize if I missed it, but I was wondering, is there any particular justification for using one social media platform over another? And how does this choice in social media fit with your research approach? Is there a reason you choose one for your research approach? Does one fit better for organizing data than another, for example? I'm just curious.
Definitely. I have not mentioned this before, but that's a great question. The short answer that you're not going to like is it depends. So it depends on your lit review, it depends on the research question that you're asking, it depends on your theory and methodology. However, if you want to look at a more visual media-based social media data, then I would recommend that you go for Instagram or TikTok. But if you wanted to look at more conversations, casual interactions between different users, then you might want to look at Twitter and even Facebook. Now, I'll put a caveat here that I don't use Facebook myself, so I don't really know anymore what the conversations are like on Facebook. And there are ethical questions about joining a private group for you to kind of mine that data. So if you're using Facebook or Reddit, then you have to be really careful about joining public and open access groups for ethical considerations. Now, in terms of organizing data, I would say that Twitter for me was the easiest rather than Instagram. because Instagram doesn't let you automatically save any of their posts. So doing everything manually was super time consuming. It was very rewarding, don't get me wrong, and I loved every minute of it, but it was very, very time consuming. So I kind of, I knew that it was going to take a long time. So when I put my project proposal and the timeline of it, I used a Gantt chart to make sure that I was, you know, in the process of my research. I made a mistake and I didn't allow enough time for that manual process. So if you're going to be using TikTok or Instagram, just make sure that you allow a bit more time in the collection process and in the cleanup process, rather than if you were just downloading information from Twitter. So from that sense, you might want to justify that you can use Twitter because it's easier, but I don't think that was going to fly very well with your supervisors just because it's easier.
Okay, great. Thank you. And on that note, I think we're coming up to time now, and we should let people move away from their screens if it's possible. So a big thank you to Maria. As always, great to hear from you and hear about your research. And yeah, as Maria said, her social media door is always open. Oh, Chloe's just put something quickly in the chat, so we can just very quickly look at that, which is about permission for data. So do you want to just respond to that quickly?
Definitely, Chloe, I think that is an excellent point. And this goes back to being a digital ethnographer. So this means that you have to be careful about the subjects that you are observing and whether or not you have the permission to observe them and therefore to use the data. That way, Townsend and Wallace's framework is really useful to consider whether the users that you're observing can reasonably expect to be observed. And if it's a closed group or a subreddit, and you don't have permission to it because that's stated, then, you know, find somewhere else, try to find somewhere else where you can find that conversation. So that's a great point.
Great, thank you. Okay, so yeah, we'll see everybody in this room soon, I hope, and thanks again to Maria, and I'll post the recording from this up on Blackboard shortly along with Maria's slides, so you can look at all of the resources and suggestions that she's put on there. Okay, thanks all.
Thanks everyone, take care.